Thank you, George, and thank you to Humanities West. It's always a pleasure to come and speak to you, and it's nice to see so many familiar faces. And I think it's okay if I say that the last time Humanities West hosted an Etruscan lecture was in February of 2020, and then the pandemic hit. And the venue has changed, and a lot of other things have changed, but I'm so happy to see such interest in the Etruscans. And as George mentioned to you, there's a very important exhibition in San Francisco that you will hear a little bit about from me and a lot about from Renee Dreyfus after I speak. So my talk today is called The Etruscans' Pasts, Present, and Futures, and I'm hoping to touch on all of those sort of time periods. And I want to start off with just introducing you to the geography of the Etruscans, and I'm showing you a map with the Etruscan names of their city-states. And I'd like you to think about the fact that Etruria, the heartland of the Etruscans, was really between the Tiber River that runs through Rome and the Arno River that runs through Florence. And of course, they expanded beyond those boundaries south and north, but the concentrated heartland of ancient Etruria was really between those two rivers. And I've got some images up on the screen that may be familiar to you. Of course, Etruscan tomb painting, their terracotta sarcophagi, and of course, their arts, which they excelled in. We are very lucky in the Bay Area right now to have such an exhibition at the Legion of Honor at our disposal, and it will be up until September 20th. So you will have plenty of time to go see these works of art that have come from some 30 different museums. I will focus a bit of my lecture today talking about some of those objects, but objects beyond, of course, what we see on display in San Francisco. And I'm just showing you a couple images here where you can see the jewelry, some bronze works that end up in a tomb, these hands that you see here, a gold cup for drinking wine. And then the image in the upper left-hand corner, I don't know if you can make out, but I think you can see that there are some chairs carved inside a tomb. That tomb is called the Tomb of the Five Chairs. So the chairs weren't brought in and installed. The rock mass was carved away from that. You can see there's a flashlight. That is the flashlight that was held by my colleague. And if you look carefully, there's a snake slithering on the bottom of that footstool. And this picture is very symbolic for me because it was taken when I was a graduate student in the summertime when I was studying Etruscan tomb architecture, in essence. And my colleague and I got a phone call saying that one of the tombs that was off limits to the public had been broken into, and they wanted us to go and see what had happened. And we went inside, and it was a hot, summer day, so I had sandals on and shorts. And when he put his flashlight at the five chairs, and it was just to get a glimpse of these remarkable carved chairs here, we didn't expect to see a snake, a poisonous snake at that. And there I was with my sandals, and I snapped this picture. So that's my Indiana Jones photograph, everybody, about me in my tombs. But again, I want to sort of, focus on the heartland of Etruria. It's really important that we understand the geography, right, for the Etruscans. And I have up here Etruria. That's the region of where the Etruscans lived. Who were the Etruscans? This is a question I asked a lot, actually. And another question is, where did they come from? And that question we no longer ask because the Etruscans didn't come from anywhere. They developed on Italian soil. So Etruscan culture was born on Italian soil. They were not imported from elsewhere in the Mediterranean. They developed on the Italian peninsula, and that's really important for you to remember. What do we know about the Etruscans? This question is something that I receive as well, because in the 20th century, the word mysterious was used quite frequently to describe Etruscans. And that word is really a trope because they're not mysterious. We actually know a lot about them. And they left a remarkable archaeological record. And I'll hope to walk you through some of the important facets of that archaeological record in my lecture. So how were Etruscans discovered, understood, or misunderstood throughout time. That is a fascinating story. For the most part, Etruscan tombs were discovered by mistake in the 1800s when farmers were plowing their fields and would literally collapse inside a tomb with an oxen, not knowing that it was at one point in time an ancient cemetery during Etruscan times. And so a lot of the tombs early on were literally found by accident. And there was a lot of confusion when items were taken out of Etruscan tombs because the Etruscans believed in the afterlife, and the wealthy Etruscans would pack their tombs with all sorts of items that the deceased could use in the afterlife. So you can imagine there was a lot of confusion because Greek vases were coming out of Etruscan tombs, Etruscan vases were coming out of Etruscan tombs, imported works from Phoenicia and beyond were also coming out of Etruscan tombs. And the Etruscans were art collectors, if you will, of all sorts of luxury items that were milling about the ancient Mediterranean. What place do the Etruscans hold in the study of the ancient Mediterranean? Quite I would say, a large story, one that has been routinely untold, which we are hoping to make up for. And that's one of the reasons why it's been a long time coming that such an exhibition take place here in California. So I've mentioned some of these past tropes and misconceptions, and I just want to put this on the screen for you. For centuries, traditional approaches to the Etruscans saw their art and culture through a Greco-Roman lens, meaning that the Etruscans were constantly compared to Greeks and Romans, which was really an unfair metric because we need to look at the Etruscans for what the Etruscans do without comparing them, let's say, per se to their neighbors. By removing this lens and examining Etruscan innovations, such as engineering, architecture, religion, their language, I'll get to their language in a bit, their art, the role of women, and so much more, we see their immense contribution to the ancient Mediterranean world. And in this light, it is important to remember that the Romans stood on the shoulders of the Etruscans. And I think it's this story that is often ignored. I want to talk about time and chronology and terminology. And I think that some of you who have had art history classes at some point in time in your life might be familiar with, terms like archaic or classical or Hellenistic, especially if you had sort of traditional courses and textbooks about the ancient Greco-Roman world. And those terms have been or were in the 20th century, cut and pasted into Etruria, and they really just don't make a lot of sense. So one of the things I try to do with my students is to sort of clarify this terminology, and I use words that really give Etruscan agency to the Etruscans. So I teach my students the chronology you see here up on the screen: Proto-Etruscan, Early Etruscan, Mid-Etruscan, and Late Etruscan. And I will refer to these dates when I present my material today. Something that you may not be aware of is that the Greeks called the Etruscans Terenoi, and that's where we get the word for the Tyrrhenian Sea. The Romans called the Etruscans Etrusci or Tusci. The Etruscans called themselves Racena or Rasna. So Racena or Rasna is actually the Etruscan word for their civilization, for their culture. And that word was lost, and the the Roman name for the Etruscans is where we get the English name Etruscan today. Toscana, for those of you who have traveled to that part of Italy, literally translates as the land of the Etruscans, Tuscany today, right? So these are important things to sort of remember. And I wanted to point out, I've got the map that I first showed you, and I wanted to point out these names. So Caestra is the Etruscan name for what is today Cerveteri. Tarquina is Tarquinia. Velc, Vulci, Veii is the only one that has really stuck. Veii is still Veii today. And something else about Etruscan city-states is that they were almost always built on a very high volcanic outcrop. And I'm showing you this image of a small example of that at Civita di Bagnoregio, which is just north of Rome. And you're looking at a volcanic tufa outcrop. And what's remarkable about this landscape is that the Etruscans built their city-states high up on these volcanic plateaus because it would make it more difficult for enemies to take over their citadel, right? It wasn't just for the view, everyone, right? So it was for the natural defensive, qualities and aspects that high outcrop would serve a community. Now, the exhibition that I refer to, which I'm saying up here, this exhibition gives us the opportunity to see the Etruscans on their own terms. I'm referencing the exhibition at the Legion of Honor, which you're going to be hearing a lot about today. So there's something very dramatic about Etruscan landscapes. This is an image at sunset in Volterra. And Volterra is just one of many of those Tuscan sort of hilltop towns. And those hilltop towns, that whole description of hilltop towns in Tuscany is really describing, in essence, Etruscan city-states. It's just that Romans built on top of those Etruscan cities, and then there was a medieval layer, Renaissance, until we get to the modern day, right? And so here is that dramatic cliff. Now, I think it's really important, and the items you're seeing here on the screen are actually on display in the Legion of Honor. We're looking at the cinerary urns that were used early on by the Etruscans. So when a relative passed away, a loved one died, they would cremate the body, place the ashes inside a container, and then bury that container underground. Oftentimes, there were sort of gender markers, if you will. You can see that the vessel on the left is topped off with a helmet. Some of these vessels, if a person had a lot of money, were not made of clay, like the two that you see here, but they could have been made of bronze, which meant, of course, that person had deep pocketbooks because bronze was incredibly expensive. The one on the right is mimicking a home, and it is actually mimicking a hut. So you can see thatched roof, the roof beams are crossing at the top, and then the rest of it would have been covered in wattle and daub, and clay on the exterior with some decoration. You can see that decoration. This is almost like a cookie jar. Your Uncle Sid has passed away, you've cremated him, you take the ashes, you put him inside the vessel, and then you bury that, right? And then around 750 to 700 BCE, something changes in the Etruscans, and they begin to practice inhumation. Now, this wasn't practiced by everyone. It was practiced by those people who could afford it. So we're talking about the aristocracy of Etruria, the aristocrats, the 2%ers, if you will. And at this particular time, large tumuli were built, and Etruscans, who were very wealthy, started burying their loved ones. So they were practicing inhumation. It doesn't mean that cremation was not used anymore. It was used simultaneously, and cremation continued to be used in certain areas of Etruria, inland areas, let's say at Chiusi, where cremation continued to be popular, even when people were very wealthy. And it was used by the lower classes because it was cheap and cheerful, right? It cost a lot of money to build a tumulus and then dig underground and plaster the walls and paint it. We're hovering in a low-flying plane here on top of the necropolis, the Etruscan cemetery at ancient Caere Cervetere, which you can see. These tumuli are quite large. Now, you have to think of a single tumulus would be built by a family, and then it would be cut up, and independent tombs would be carved in a single tumulus. Think of it like a pie, right? And so a single family could own this, and then generations after would carve into that tumulus and bury their loved ones. So they're really family mausoleums in a way, right? You have to think of them like that. And the Etruscans capitalized off of the natural rock that was readily made available, and this is what we call tuff in English, but tuffo in Italian, which is a volcanic rock. And this type of rock is pretty remarkable because it is pliable when you carve it, but the more it comes into contact with oxygen, the harder it becomes. So Etruscans were building their tumuli from this volcanic rock. They would then carefully carve out all the stones, and this was not ad hoc, just chipping away, but cutting blocks of stone that they would recycle and use for foundations of temples, of homes, of bridges, of roads, et cetera, et cetera. So we're talking about engineers here that were highly skilled. One such tomb that some of you might have heard of before, if you've traveled to Rome and gone to the Vatican Museum, that dates to the 7th century BCE, and the tomb that is famous because it was found intact is the Regolini Galassi tomb. And this was found at ancient Kaisra, modern-day Cerveteri. This is a modern reconstruction of what that tomb looked like. And a woman who was quite wealthy and must have had incredible status was laid out in the main chamber with about 300 objects that were placed inside the tomb for her to use in the afterlife. In the side chamber, there were ashes found in a cinerary urn of a man. So this is time when we're seeing both inhumation and cremation happening at the same time. The objects from this remarkable tomb are actually housed in the Vatican Museum today. So for those of you who have been to the Vatican, you might have seen some of these. But the opulence in the gold jewelry and the silver vessels is quite remarkable. And I'm showing you a sort of a golden chest plate. This is all made in sheets of gold that are decorated in relief. We call that repoussé. And then you see on the right-hand side of the screen, that's actually a huge, it's about this big, everybody, decorative safety pin. Now, not all scholars agree on how this safety pin actually functioned as a safety pin, but a fibula is a safety pin. And here is a picture of it today as it is displayed in the Vatican Museum. And you can see there are a series of these ducks, water birds, either water birds or ducks, and they are decorated in a style that we call granulation. And granulation, really, in essence, if you can think of a dental explorer and welding tiny microscopic balls with a dental explorer to create the sort of relief lines in the decoration you see here, that's what the Etruscans were doing, of course, without a microscope, which is quite remarkable, all right? So this is, representing very, very skilled sort of craftspeople at this particular time. Within the Regolini Galassi tomb, and on show here in San Francisco, you can see these silver vases that were also placed in this tomb, and this remarkable inscription on one silver cup that is written in Etruscan that says Larthia, and that must have been the name of this woman who was buried in this tomb. These items, in addition to this magnificent bronze cauldron, are on display in San Francisco, a stone's throw away, and here until, again, September 20th. You're looking not only at what was probably a ceremonial cauldron with these feline heads that are sticking out, but also you're looking at these clay figurines that are made in bucaro, and I'll talk about bucaro in a moment, of mourners. So those came in, they were like a set, and they were placed along Larthia, and they're symbolic mourners, right? They're women who are mourning the death of Larthia placed alongside her. Quite remarkable. Now, I referenced that the big cauldron is bronze, and like most bronze that you'll see in my slideshow and even in the exhibit, the bronze that we see today that has survived is green in color. But back in the day, it would have been a shiny gold bronze color. The green that you see is from patina. That's the oxidization of the bronze itself. So you kind of have to remind yourself it wouldn't have looked green in Etruscan times. Now, something I think you should remember, especially when we're talking about the Etruscan elites and those who were quite wealthy and could afford to pack their tombs with all sorts of opulent items, they had funeral processions. From the home to the tomb. And these funeral processions evolved into competitive parades of the elite ruling families where opulent objects were displayed from the home to the tomb. The catered funeral feasts were powerful institutions of Etruscan society. Now, I just mentioned catered funeral feasts, and I would like you to know that there's a lot of evidence, not only because banquet items are left in tombs, but there have been food items left in tombs that the Etruscans partook in some sort of mock banquet with small, portable items they could eat and, of course, drink in honor of the deceased. Banqueting was a quintessential part of Etruscan culture. I'll touch on that later on in my lecture as well. I'd like you to get a sense of just how large some of these tombs could be. And you're looking at the tomb of the shields at Kaysera, modern Cervetere. This dates to the 6th century BCE. Look at the ceiling, because you're looking at beams that could support a second story. So we're well beyond the architecture of the hut from the 9th century BCE, and Etruscans by the 6th century BCE could have certainly been building two-story buildings, and these beams that you see here carved in the stone support that. You can also see the thrones, and of course the tomb takes its name from those shields that are carved on the wall as well. This is what that tomb looks like when people are inside. So that same space, to give you a sense of scale, I wanted to show you an image with people inside that same tomb. These are students from the Rensselaer School of Architecture. And I'm giving a lecture. I'm actually sitting on one of the thrones there, and those are students listening. But I think this image is compelling because you get a sense of how Etruscans are not only using their cut stones for the superstructure above ground for the tumulus, but then carving a entryway, a hallway down underground, and then taking out all of that stone, removing it. And what you're looking at here is also a painted tomb where a whole other set of artisans would come in, plaster the wall, and another set of artisans would come in and then paint the wall, right? So this is the very first fresco paintings, and the very first fresco painters of ancient Italy, of course, were the Etruscans, right? Not the Romans, the Etruscans. So this is really interesting, and it's I think important to think about these tombs as memory monuments. I have up here memory archives and memory monuments, because once you would bury your loved one, there was a lot of activity at the cemeteries. Etruscans would go back for certain rituals, funerary rituals, and that all took place outside the tomb. It would have been very expensive to open up the tomb wall again, because once you buried your loved one, you would close that with a stone door of sorts and seal off that crevice, the wall, with clay. And then you wouldn't reopen it unless somebody else died again in the family, right? So all those ceremonies, those funerary ceremonies that you did outside the tomb, right? So just sort of so that you all know that. And since we talk about tombs, I think one of the most sort of evocative and provocative aspects of Etruscan tomb decor, of course, are their wall paintings. And it's through their wall paintings where we really enter into the Etruscans, if you will. And we see these important moments where they're capturing daily life, intimate life, private life, all painted in their tombs. And I think you should think about the following. There are some decorative conventions in Etruscan wall painting. The banquet is one of them, which was incredibly popular. But each individual family or person, if you will, would choose their tomb decor most likely before they died. Is that clear? So they had their own idea about what kind of wall painting they wanted on their tomb. It was very personal. And this is why I say we learn a lot about sort of the private world of the Etruscans vis-a-vis their wall painting. We also learn a lot about what they thought about the underworld from these wall paintings. And you're looking at figures on the left and to the right, and I'm standing next to one, of underworld figures that you're looking at one with blue skin holding a bearded snake. You're looking at another one with kind of grayish blue skin. That's Karu. He's holding a big mallet. He's holding a mallet because he's going to open up the gates to the underworld, and then he's going to close the gates of the underworld, right? He has a job. And here we're looking at Vanth, winged with a torch, and she would use that torch to help guide you, the deceased, down into the underworld. So we know a lot more about these painted figures than ever before. And I'm happy to say there are some remarkable examples of Vanth here in San Francisco right now at the Legion of Honor. She's a fascinating figure, and the name Vanth has no counterpart in the Greco-Roman world. And I think it's important to note that the Etruscans had their own celestial beings and their own divinities they also adopted the Greek pantheon, Etruscanized the names of the Greco-Roman pantheon, and incorporated that into their religion as well. But they also had their own divinities pre-Greco-Roman contact. Is that clear? Vanth is one of those divinities, this underworld figure who would guide you down into the underworld. And both of these artifacts are in San Francisco right now. And the one on the right is a bronze statuette, and you can see Vanth is winged. She's also kind of charging forward, and she's brandishing snakes, these bearded snakes. And that would probably be to like ward off any evil down into the underworld, right? Clear the way, because I am escorting a new arrival down into the underworld. And this is sort of how we think of Vanth today. So we look at tombs and the world of the dead to actually reconstruct and learn about the world of the living. And I'll show you this image, which I'm sure so many of you have seen before. If you have, just raise your hand if you remember seeing this at any point in time as you looked to Etruscan things. You can see it on menus in Tuscany, on wine labels. It's on pasta and cookies and coffee. You can see it everywhere. Tuscans are incredibly proud, and they should be, of their Etruscan past. There's sort of a regional self-esteem, if you will. And so this is the one figure that you can easily see all over Tuscany today. It's the Tomb of the Leopards. It dates to the 5th century BC, about 480 to be exact. I mentioned the banquet to you, and this is a typical sort of banquet scene, a very popular decorative motif that is more often than not painted on the back wall of an Etruscan tomb. And for those of you who think that the Scots invented plaid, take a look at the blankets here on the beds. And you're looking at men and women who are reclining. And one recliner is holding out an egg. Can everybody see that right here in his hand? And the egg was sort of a symbol of the afterlife and fertility and so much more. Now, I think I've mentioned that I all teach, but when I started my early teaching career, I actually took students routinely to Italy and would teach on site in Etruria. I actually lived there for quite a long time. And one of the very first groups of students I took around, I was happy to see named their first album cover, The Tomb of the Leopards. And they're actually a San Francisco group, the Corner Laughers, so you might want to look that up. It's a little shout out to these students. I mentioned to you how personal these tombs are, and that they were sort of custom designed, if you will, by the owners of the tomb. And I think one of the most remarkable tombs that has survived is the Tomb of the Hunting and Fishing. It is a 2-room tomb. I'm only showing you the back room. And you are, when you walk into this tomb, engulfed by life on the Tyrrhenian Sea. And you are drawn into this panoramic view of birds swooping down, fishermen pulling up nets from the sea, dolphins jumping in and out of the water. And something that I think is a remarkable aspect of Etruscan art is they did not have fear of color. And so they put color here on birds and on dolphins that they didn't actually see in real life. You can see dolphins are red, white, and blues. The birds also are multicolor. And I'll show you a close-up so you can see this is a kaleidoscope, if you will, of nature and humans interacting with nature. You have a hunter with a slingshot who's hunting birds. The birds are swooping down to pick up fish from the nets of the fishermen, the nets that the fishermen are pulling up, and the dolphins are trying to also, catch the fish. It's a beautiful, beautiful landscape. And I'm using that word landscape because most of the textbooks of the 20th century will say that the Romans were the first to invent landscape painting, and that's clearly not the case. And so if there's something I want you to walk away with, I'd like you to remember that the Etruscans were the ones who brought landscape painting to us, and early on. This is a tomb that dates to the 6th century BCE. Above the panoramic view of the Tyrrhenian Sea, we see an aristocratic couple banqueting above, their servants on both sides of them. They're looking at each other. and caressing one another. That is another element of Etruscan culture, the sort of intimacy that we see between husbands and wives that is often missing in their neighbors. I'll just say that. Now, on the left wall of the same tomb, you're looking at a diver who is taking the plunge. And he has climbed up this cliff. In fact, he has someone who's spotting him behind. He also has spotters in a boat in the sea. Can you all make them out? They must have been telling him when it was appropriate to dive, like on the seventh wave when it was the fullest, right? And so he is plunging down. I've been into this tomb and I've taken a very careful look at this diver, and I can tell you he is smiling as he's diving down into the water. It's quite remarkable. So again, the emphasis on landscape, right? And the appreciation of landscape on the part of the Etruscans. These sorts of scenes are celebrated in Italy today. I'm just showing you some wine labels, Prosecco. I'm even showing you a wedding cake. And this is a wedding cake. Who would go about even choosing this particular Etruscan tomb to put on their wedding cake? Well, modesty stops me from telling you who would do that. But that is a wedding cake. All right. I'm going to pivot for a moment, and I'd like to sort of remind you all of Roman history so that you can get a sense of, well, how did the Romans and the Etruscans overlap? And how did that take place? Well, that in and of itself is a much longer story than I have time to talk about today. But I will say a few things, and I've got the Roman monarchy up here and the seven kings of Rome. And I'd like you to remember that the last kings of Rome were Etruscan. Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and Tarquinius Superbus were all Etruscans. And you see the name Tarquinius because they were coming from Tarquinia, right? So they were elite Etruscan families coming down to the area that we call Rome today, and they were ruling. These are kings. So Rome would have looked very much like an Etruscan city when these Etruscan kings were ruling. Is that clear, everyone? And in fact, the most important temple, the largest temple that stood on the Capitoline Hill was actually built during the reign of the Etruscan monarchy. And that temple had a very deep porch. This is a replica of it, if you will. You can only see the foundations today if you go to the Capitoline underneath one of the museums. This is a modern, reconstruction, a colorful reconstruction. It's colorful in the right way because Etruscans, as I said before, were not, chromophobic. They loved, color, and their temples and houses and tombs were painted. But this particular temple, the most important one in Rome at the end of the 6th century BCE, we are told by Roman writers was decorated by no other than an Etruscan sculptor, and his name is mentioned by Roman writers, Vulca, and he came from the Etruscan city of Veii. And Pliny the Elder even writes that the finest images of deities of that era were inside this temple, and they were more admired than gold, right? And they were actually fashioned out of clay and painted. So really, really interesting. And inside the Legion of Honor, you will see an installation of some of this terracotta decoration that's similar, if you will, to the tradition that we see on the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline. And this was used there was pediment decor from a funerary shrine from Vulci, and that is in San Francisco right now. How many of you have seen this before? Maybe not in person, but you recognize it because you've seen it in an art history book or something. This is the sarcophagus of the married couple. It's life-size. It is very, very large. It was made all in clay. And so when you make a sarcophagus like this, and it's greenware, and it's dried, and you have to fire it, you don't pick it up and carry it into a kiln because it will break. You build the kiln around it. So these were very, very expensive to make. There are a handful that have survived. They were made at ancient Caesarea, modern Cerveteri today. The one you're looking at is actually in the Villa Giulia Museum, and here's a close-up. And again, it shows that intimacy that I discussed of Etruscan husbands and wives embracing one another, which was a sort of core component of Etruscan culture. And there were lots of smaller versions of these large sarcophagi. And here's one that's actually in the Legion of Honor, which is quite lovely. You can go see it. It's a terracotta cinerary urn, again, of husbands and wives. They would have been holding either perfume vessels or maybe an egg or floral leis. And this one is from the Louvre. Speaking of husbands and wives, let's look at this photo, which is on display in San Francisco. It's of Tinia and Uni. And these are the Etruscan names for Jupiter and Juno. Okay, these are the Etruscan names. And he is grabbing her breast. We see this scene quite often. It is meant to, represent their union, right? He's grabbing her breast. She's lifting up her dress a little bit. And I had the pleasure of writing the chapter in the catalog for this exhibition on the topic of women with my colleague Alexandra Carpino, and I have the quote up here. The celebration of the couple was a cherished and long-standing component of Etruscan culture. Intimate poses of husbands and wives were a venerable aspect of their iconic portrayal of embracing couples. So you can see this bronze statuette, which is quite remarkable and nicely preserved in San Francisco. Now, I mentioned Bucaro early on when I was talking about the Regolini Galassi figurines. Now, Bucaro is made of terracotta. So Bucaro is made of terracotta clay. It has this distinguishing black veneer to it. It is not painted black. There is not a black slip that covers the terracotta. It is black because of a firing process called reduction. So the Etruscan craftspeople understood how to stoke a kiln and get it as hot as possible, and then cut off all the oxygen so that the terracotta would bleed black through and through. And that is how you achieve this sort of black veneer, this type of pottery. Is that clear, everyone? Now, you're looking at a skiphos, which is a drinking cup. The artist has incised it before it was fired, so a Bucaro drinking cup, and this remarkable stand, which actually comes from UC Berkeley, from the Phoebe Hearst collection, with rows of rings. So these are all clay rings that are hanging from other sets of rings on the vessel. It is one of the most unusual pieces to have survived of Bucaro, with this complicated, intricate, pattern, which is quite remarkable. Also from UC Berkeley is this Bucaro stand. I like to call it a fruit stand. We're naming it a stand, but we're not quite sure how the Etruscans were using it. At any rate, it too is decorated with mold reliefs of animals, and you can see some of the animals, panthers and panther faces. Now, there are all sorts of items that were made in Bucaro. You're looking at a tiny vessel, which is on display in San Francisco, which could have been used as a jug, or some scholars have argued an inkstand. And they argue that it's an inkstand because you can see the alphabet here written, right? And I want to say something about the Etruscan alphabet for a moment. So the Etruscans spoke and wrote a non-Indo-European language. A non-Indo-European language, even though they were in the middle of the Indo-European area. They borrowed the Greek alphabet as a tool to write down their language. An alphabet doesn't make up your language. It's a tool you use to write down your language, right? So their language is not related to Greek or Latin or Sanskrit. The alphabet the Greeks used, they borrowed from the Phoenicians. So we have the Phoenician alphabet that was created by Phoenicians. The Greeks borrowed that alphabet. The Etruscans borrowed it from the Greeks. The Romans borrowed it from the Etruscans, and we have that alphabet today. Is that clear? In fact, if you look carefully, you can see what we refer to today as A, B, C, and D on the left-hand side. Can everybody see that? This is a remarkable artifact, and it's in Florence, of an ivory writing tablet for a very wealthy young person because it's made out of ivory, which was imported. And up above, you can see from the right to the left, the alphabet at the top. So the plate here would have had wax coated inside. You could use a warm stone to smooth the wax. Then you would take a sharp instrument and practice the alphabet, writing the alphabet. So this was probably for a young Etruscan. It's a remarkable, remarkable artifact. And one of the most remarkable artifacts that has survived, which reflects the Etruscan language, is the Liber Lentius. It's a linen book, and it's on display. Renee, you're going to be talking about this, I think, when you give your talk. And this is here in San Francisco. It is the longest Etruscan inscription that has survived, and it was written on linen that was wrapped around a mummy and survived because it was found in Egypt. Is that clear? So there's lots of questions you might have about this, and I'm sure Renee will talk about it when she gives her paper. So I just want you to know that the word vinum, which is where we get the Italian word vino for wine, is mentioned on this text multiple times. And another important work that is here in San Francisco, but also is so symbolic of Etruscan religion, is this model of a sheep's liver. And the Etruscans would divinate by looking at the liver of a sacrificed sheep. And they used it as sort of a celestial map, if you will, to predict the future. And this liver is a remarkable artifact, and I'm sure Renee's going to talk about it, that has never left Piacenza, ever. It's never traveled to Rome or Florence or London, and it's here in San Francisco. And there's a nice story about how Renee was able to bring this artifact here to the Bay Area, and you can see it proudly displayed now at the Legion of Honor. There are all sorts of artifacts out there, not just a sheep's liver per se, that was used as a model for priests to teach young priests and priestesses how to divinate, but also we see images of priests holding a sheep's liver as a model here. And here's one such cinerary urn, and this is from Volterra. There are a remarkable amount of female votive heads on display in San Francisco, and they come from UC Berkeley, they come from the Hearst collection, and they all come from one single site, ancient Caesarea, modern Cervetere, where a votive deposit was discovered with some 1,000 votive artifacts. 97% of them were depictions of women. 800 of those votives made their way to UC Berkeley at the turn of the 20th century, 1902 to be exact. And a good number of these are on display in San Francisco right now. And I have here face-to-face the 800 terracotta votives from ancient Cairo, which are housed in the Phoebe Hearst Museum, were oncely bright painted. So I'm telling you this because when you're looking at the clay heads, you cannot see the color that once survived and was actually, painted on these faces, which would have showed makeup and lipstick and rouge and all hair colors and all sorts of things. But these are really remarkable, remarkable artifacts that tell us a lot about the role of women in Etruscan society, the role of women in Etruscan religious practice, and the role of women at sanctuaries, because these were found at sanctuaries. Now, I talked about Etruscan past, I've talked about Etruscan present, and I want to talk a little bit about futures. And I think the future part that I'd like to say is that there are more and more classes offered now on the Etruscans than ever before. There are more and more articles being published and books, And the Archaeological Institute of America, which is the United States' oldest institution dedicated to archaeology, every year at their annual meeting has a record number of Etruscan panels. And so the interest in Etruscans continues to grow. It started growing in the, I would say in the 1980s here in the United States. And one of the reasons for that is because the National Geographic article came out in 1988 and did a feature article on the Etruscans. And this type of interest has allowed even the Archaeological Institute of America to sponsor trips to Italy, where you can learn all about the Etruscans. And I'm here with Renee Dreyfus and Louise Chu. You'll hear from Renee soon, as we did this trip for a group of interested Etruscophiles, I'll say, in October of this past year. The next one will take place this coming October. So if you're interested, you can ask me about it. So I really wanted to hone in on, how important it is to reframe the Etruscans, and how important it is to examine and think about the Etruscans in ways that fully engage and contextualize their history and material culture. And the fact that we are looking at them through a new lens with new perspectives allows us to better situate our understandings of the past as Etruscan studies forges into the future. And reframing the Etruscans chronologically, historically, and geopolitically, and artistically brings us closer to their ancient Mediterranean footprint. And that's what's really important to me as an Etruscologist. We are living in a watershed moment where the 21st century invites us to broaden our horizons and update how we study the past. And at UC Berkeley, and I don't know if you all know this, but the largest Etruscan collection in all of North America is at UC Berkeley. It's in the Hearst Museum. There are some 4,000 artifacts, Etruscan artifacts in the Hearst Museum. And I had the distinct pleasure of teaching classes, and I do teach these classes, but I had the pleasure of focusing 2 classes on actually doing exhibits. And you're looking at me working with students down in the basement at the Hearst Museum, bringing the artifacts up to the main exhibition room. And not only did my students open up an exhibition in the Hearst Museum, but also in the Doe Library in the main lobby. And that is open when the library is open and will be open until the end of August. So these are really important opportunities for students to gain a lot of knowledge about the Etruscans, to have hands-on experience with ancient artifacts, and also to learn skills about curation and collection histories. And so I'm just kind of sharing some of these recent photographs with students. Here are some of the promotional posters. The students even created an Instagram account called UC Etruscans for UC Berkeley. And with that, I want to close, but before I do, and I think it was it Kalena? Yes, who asked me how I got interested in archaeology, and if you will just entertain me for one more minute, I'll tell you that story. So I'll tell you the story of a young girl who was studying the Egyptians, and at that time, the King Tut exhibit was coming. How many of us get interested in archaeology or the ancient world through the Egyptians? I'm one of them. And do any of you remember this? 1979 here in San Francisco, this was one of the biggest things that ever happened, I think, in the Bay Area in terms of archaeology and art history. And this young girl asked her father, a contractor in Northern California, if he could get tickets. The tickets were sold out. It was impossible. There were horrific lines that one had to wait in to get these tickets. Do you all remember? This is before Ticketmaster or anything you could do online. It didn't exist. You had to physically go down to San Francisco. Well, that was out of the question. The tickets were sold out. But her father did a kitchen remodel and asked the owner of this house for payment in tickets to the King Tut exhibit. And she was able to go. And she went through this exhibit, pressed her face against the glass, her imagination was literally set ablaze. And it had a life-changing impact on her. That young girl was me, and that young curator was Renee Dreyfuss. And the show was routinely referred to as the young girl curator exhibiting the boy king. And I want to say thank you, Renee, because you've done so much for me on a personal level. As a scholar, as an archaeologist, it's been an amazing moment in my career to be able to work alongside of you on this Etruscan exhibition. I thank you so much. Thank you all.
On the thoughtful while they change.
I'm gonna leave that up here. I hope I didn't take up too much time.
No.
Okay.
All right, as Wendy is showing, if you have questions we'll have a Q&A session for both speakers afterwards, as we usually do, so you can start thinking about that. And while we change computers, I thought I'd say something that happened just the other night. Renee and I were having dinner, and we were talking about Egypt and her next project, and all these projects. As I said, she brought King Tut. We know she brought Ramses. And of course, this is her project, and I don't know how many exhibits you've brought to San Francisco in the last 60 years, but it has been a tremendous number. So we were talking, and I said, well, in 1986, my wife and I were on our honeymoon, and we went to Egypt. And we went to the Valley of the Kings in Luxor, Temple of Luxor, and we had this great guide who was telling us all about Luxor and a bunch of very interesting information about it. And it turned out that he was actually in charge, the director of the Cairo Museum. And he was just taking a weekend in Luxor. And she said, oh, Muhammad Saleh Ali. And I said, oh, yeah. So I looked him up after the dinner, and the picture of him, and it's exactly that man. So we were talking. So in 1986, and she knew him because she did the work back in '79 and everything. This woman's network in the ancient archaeology, world of ancient archaeology is enormous. And she doesn't have time to tell you all the secrets of how she got people to give her all these different pieces of art for this exhibit, but she should be negotiating with us for us in Iran right now. The war would be over. So, Renee Dreyfuss.
Thanks so much.
Sure.
I have to say, with an introduction like that and Lisa's introduction, a little hard for me to make certain that I continue in the same fashion. Of course, it makes me feel very old to have done the King Tut show in 1979. And I like to say that I brought it back again. It was not an easy chore to bring it back again. I wanted to do so because I thought there was an entire new audience, and it was possible to do it in 30 years later. And why that was important for me 30 years later is because for an Egyptian pharaoh, after 30 years of rule, there was something called the Sed Festival, where the gods would give strength and fertility and knowledge to the king so that he could serve longer. And I thought to myself, okay, 30 years, and it was 30 years to the month, bringing the King Tut show back again, that was my Sed Festival. So I just keep going, right? So that was a brilliant introduction, Lisa. Thank you so much. That was so good. Her students are so lucky. And this is an opportunity for me to say that I wanted to do this show since the 1990s. before some of you were born even. I was impressed by the Etruscans. I grew up in New York City. They had a vast, wonderful gallery full of Etruscan treasures. Some of them turned out to be fakes, but didn't matter because it was already imprinted in my head that the Etruscans were marginalized. They were people who had done so much, who had taught us so much through the Romans, and then, of course, to our own civilization, our Western civilization. They needed to have to become center stage. They needed to have somebody in this country to speak for them. And I wanted to do this exhibition each time. Okay, King Tut, Alexander the Great, what else did I do? The last one, Ramses, but before that, Last Supper in Pompeii. As George said, I have an exhibition that opens August 1st. It's called The Treasures of the Pharaohs. I'm going back to Egypt at that point. But, you know, there was always something else that got in the way. But having professors like Lisa in this country, it changes everything about the Etruscans. This is the right time to have this show. This is the time that really I was waiting for. The scholars have learned so much more. There are new excavations happening, discovering new things. We don't have to just look at tombs now. We could look at cities. The language, this non-Indo-European language that has no ancestors, it has no descendants. I mean, scholars are finally beginning to understand how they wrote and what they wrote. This was the time. Museum galleries, the Louvre has a new gallery on the Etruscans. The British Museum has a new gallery on the Etruscans. The Metropolitan has. You know, finally, the Etruscans are getting their fame. And that's why this exhibition really is finally the right time to do it. And I have to say, some of you have seen it already, working with a brilliant team at my museum, working with Louise Chu, who's my associate curator. We have a great exhibition designer, a graphic designer. You know, it's just a brilliant installation, I feel. And what's important about it is that we have the narrative. We have the narrative to talk about the Etruscans. And this is the catalog that Lisa was mentioning. And there are 25 different essays in here, each of them talking about different aspects of the Etruscans in a way that introduces new ideas, and also it's a beautiful full-color coffee table, wonderful photographs that includes objects that are well known, like some of the ones we've just seen, but also objects that are not iconic. They're not the pieces that you normally go to a museum and see. And we were tutored, Louise and I, by Richard de Puma, who's an Etruscologist who has spent all of his life looking in every corner of every university storage unit, everywhere that he could find anything about the Etruscans. And it's thanks to him that we have some of these unknown objects. So we feel that even after the exhibition closes, that the catalog is going to be something that will be useful for students and scholars alike. So when I started working on an Etruscan exhibition, and people said to me, what are you working on next? And I said, well, an exhibition about the Etruscans. You know, go to Europe, everybody's heard about the Etruscans. You know, you go to Italy, and there are people who feel they're descendants of the Etruscans. But in this country, they said, okay, the Etruscans, let's see. The crustaceans, is that what you mean, the crustaceans? And Lisa and I have a colleague who said, have you ever gone to Siri and say, Siri, bring up something about the Etruscans? And I said, no, I never tried that. He said, try it. So I tried it, and it came out trash can. We have, Louise found the picture with Oscar the Grouch. And in fact, I tried it then, and it came up trash can. So I knew that there was going to be a difficulty in trying to describe who the Etruscans were, where they lived, when they lived, why are they important, why are we presenting them now? And the same colleague said to me that, did I know that Alfred Hitchcock was in love with Etruscan objects? And I said, no, I haven't, and looked a little further, and there, in fact, was a picture of him as an Etruscan cinerary urn in this case. And I thought, wow, how interesting that his film that we all know about, that focuses on the looking backwards and forwards in history, Vertigo. It takes place in San Francisco, another reason why it's good to open the show here. But also there were images of the Legion of Honor. So a perfect place for us to do this exhibition at the Legion of Honor, where we have our antiquities collection. Well, another reason is not that long ago, 2018, there was a film that was partially shot at the Legion of Honor, and this is upstairs as you enter the upper rotunda, and it was called The Etruscan Smile. They made a copy of the sarcophagus of the spouses because it was meant to be in a museum that contained Etruscan objects. So this is made out of, I don't know, plaster, some impermanent thing because it was destroyed soon afterwards. But it kind of shows in not an appropriate way. I mean, they're holding each other. It's very different. But as you can see, it's meant to be the sarcophagus of the spouses. So I didn't see this film, but I looked it up, and it said that a man who knows he has a terminal disease is looking back on his life, and he's thinking to himself, you know, I've had a pretty good life. I really feel that you know, I enjoyed my life, and you know, I have nothing to feel sorry about as he looks forward to his ultimate dying. And I thought, you know, the Etruscan Smile. I don't know anything else about this film, but if that is the message, it's the same kind of message that the Etruscans had, right? They were looking forward into the next world, and that it was going to be as wonderful as the one that they had, the time they had on this plane. So we all know now about where the Etruscans landed, that they were of Italic soil, that we don't have to look, as some of the ancients did, to other places to see that this was where the Etruscans were centered. Right near Bologna, there's a cemetery that has some of the very earliest cinerary urns that you've seen examples of now. And so that's going back to around 900 BC. You know, we can see that the Etruscans really came from the Italian peninsula. Tuscany, of course, is named after them. But then they spread their city-states. They were wealthy people because they were traders throughout the Mediterranean, and that they had their city-states not really truly unified, but these wealthy city-states that they developed. And what held them together was their culture, their language, and their religion, certainly, but the fact that they all traded some of these natural resources that were plentiful where they had settled. And that includes agricultural products, it includes timber, tin, copper, iron. And it's because they had, especially the copper and some tin, those are the metals that make up bronzes. And so they became very wealthy, being able to trade bronze, the raw materials, as well as finished products. And this is a part of what made them wealthy, and also what held together the different city-states of the Etruscans. Okay, some of you have now seen the exhibition, and as I say, we have a brilliant exhibition designer. We wanted to have an installation that would echo some of those tombs that you've now seen, these round domes tombs. And the museum never has very much in the way of money, and we had to figure out a way to do that using what we had in our budget. And I think this is very effective. And when you walk down the ramp at the Legion of Honor and you walk into the exhibition, these are the objects from the Vatican Museum that were found in the Regolini Galassi tomb. And the tomb that was owned by a woman, and she's laid out on a funerary couch. You saw the picture of that Lisa showed, and there was a male cinerary, a male in a cinerary urn also. But here are some of these glorious objects that are in this tomb, and the Vatican director and the Vatican director of the Etruscan Museum and the director over all of the the Vatican museums were very generous, and they let me have pretty much everything that I asked for. In some cases, I had to nag a lot, but this was easy enough. There are the silver vessels that you saw. One of them has her name on it. A gold bracelet. There are two of them. They lent the better one. This incredible bronze cauldron with these feline heads coming out. A work like this, the Etruscans would have seen, especially in Western Anatolia, today's Turkey. And that's where, on the Ionian coast, you had the Greeks settled. And as the Greeks were settled there, they picked up a lot of the Near Eastern influence, the iconography. And here, from a group of people called Urartians, from Urartu, today's eastern Turkey, we have something that shows this kind of amalgamation, this interest in the Mediterranean world in the first millennium BC that shows everybody knew everybody else, and the iconography, the imagery that they put on their on their works of art or ritual objects reflect that they know about everybody else. And in the upper left is one of my favorite things in the exhibition. That we have the best example. The Vatican has 3 of them. This is a small little bowl made by the Phoenicians, probably made in Cyprus, but it's silver gilt, and on it you can see images from the ancient Assyrian world, and that's northern Iraq today, marching soldiers, but then you also see Egyptianizing imagery. In the old days, we would have called this Orientalizing, and in the catalog, the director of the Etruscan Museum still calls them Orientalizing, but we know what that means. It means it's picking up ideas and images from the East. Well, in that round tomb-like structure, there are other things that come from the tombs of the elites, and in this case, other tombs. Upper left-hand corner, we have a beautiful example from Praeneste, today's Palestrina. It's from the Villa Giulia, and they also were amazing with their loans. And it has snake heads coming out. And there are other examples of these marching soldiers. Some of the soldiers on horseback has a very warrior-like imagery, but you also have waterfowl around the top row of it. It's silver gilt. Lisa showed this. It's solid gold. And it has sphinxes on the handles looking into the bowl. Well, this one took a lot of work. It's normally in Tarquinia, and it has on it an Egyptian cartouche, the name of an Egyptian pharaoh, and it has the name of a pharaoh who lived around, 715 BC, 720 to 715, which then dates the tomb. They used to call tombs like this princely tombs. This is probably from another tomb of a woman's burial. But it's made out of faience, which is something that the Egyptians invented and then passed on to the Greeks. But a work like this and other examples that you're seeing here and in the previous slide could have been diplomatic gifts, gifts that were handed to someone to get favor from them, and then maybe they were passed down as heirlooms. And they were so precious that then the owner of the tomb wanted them placed in their own tomb for use in the next world. Here you have an ostrich egg. The Phoenicians were brilliant. They could carve little seashells, ostrich eggs. They first drained the ostrich eggs, and then you can see here how they very delicately, without cracking the shell, were able to create these images on it. They have real animals and imaginary animals and decorative elements. And the Phoenicians were well known for this. And this is from the British Museum, and they have two examples. The other example has bright color on it. Okay, you walk into the second gallery, and here you have some of these precious objects that are the earliest examples from the Etruscan world, and they're all of them terracotta and just beautifully displayed in our exhibition in this gallery. Some of them are Bucaro, and some of them are, let's see, impasto. The earliest pottery was impasto. It was a coarse fabric. It held, could have mica in it. It could have coarse grains in it. But nonetheless, they were able to smooth it over to create things. The stand and the bowl in the middle is over 5 feet tall. And as Lisa was saying about banquets being important, they were important during a lifetime, they were important at the funerary banquet, and then objects like this were placed in the tombs so that in the future they could continue that same tradition. Very, absolutely gorgeous. And you've seen these two now in Lisa's slides, but cinerary urns. One of them, a hut urn, that tells us something about how they lived, because for the most part, these houses, these early houses, were made out of material that rotted away. And so to have something like this that shows you, one, what their houses looked like, but two, that they thought that their tomb was their home for eternity. Well, the Louvre was also very generous. When you walk into their new gallery, and it's only a couple years that they've installed it, the first thing you see is this huge, it's a crater, but it's a pyxis meaning it has a little lid on it. And this is called red slipware because they smooth the surface made out of that, the impasto ware that is smoothed with this red slip, which is some of the clay that has a lot of water and a lot of fluid so that it could be placed over the surface and then painted white. And in this case, once again, you have images that come from the Western Asia, let's say, the ancient Near East, where you have a bull and a lion confronting each other. On the other side, there are two bulls, but it's one of our favorite pieces in the exhibition. Well, the Bucaro pot that Louise and I are the most proud of is this one. It's an amphora. It is unusual because it has 4 what they call strap handles, and it has these incised decorations. And around its middle, there are these animals, some of them with human heads, some of them, very make-believe animals, and others real animals. For some reason, there's a fish under what looks like a moose, I don't know. But you can see human-headed, bearded figures, all of these marching around the center. Louise and I happened to see this in a gallery in New York. I knew we wanted it for our permanent collection, which has Etruscan art, but I also knew that we were doing, finally, after all of these years, we were finally doing the Etruscan show, and that this could be one of our stars. So we went halfies on it, and we bought it for the museum, and we bought it in honor of George and Judy Marcus, who endowed my position. So that's the kinds of things that I think really make wonderful stories. 2 fabulous Bucaro pieces, and when you see them this way, they do look a lot like metal, don't they? They look like it could be some silver vessels. They were polished before they were put into the kiln. As Lisa said, it was a high temperature, and that all the vents were closed so that the smoke would go throughout all of the walls, making the interior as black as the outside. And these are removable bull's heads that were placed in. That's one of the prize pieces in the Vatican. And from the Field Museum, this is a rather large hydria meant to hold water, never on view. We had a chance to go into their storage area and actually, oh, let's see, I'll take that. How about that? How about that? And as long as they were, well, they weren't, we had to make sure they weren't fragile, of course. But that's one of their prized possessions. Well, you've heard about the Phoebe Hearst collection. And this is a marvelous sarcophagus lid. The woman was laid out in the sarcophagus. She is resting throughout eternity. She has her head on a pillow. Her hand is holding her drapery. This is from the Hearst Museum, which I think Lisa usually must have said has the largest collection of Etruscan art in America. So the Hearst Museum does not have a lot of space for showing art. It was meant as a study collection. That's, Mrs. Hearst had it in mind that this would, she bought it all to give to the UC Berkeley. She also gave some incredible Egyptian objects, especially the really early material. And, you know, she wanted to help students, and indeed she has. But whenever there's an opportunity to borrow anything from the Hearst Museum, I like to do that. And when you look carefully, so look at where her feet are, you can see how much red is still on this. I mean, it was all that brightly colored paint that Lisa was showing you. We're going to take a look also at some of the figures that are in the back in just a moment. But before we do that, I want to show, again, you've seen this now, this image of the cinerary urn of the spouses. It's not the sarcophagus of the spouses, it's a cinerary urn. But in many ways, it is more complete than the one in the Villa Giulia in Rome and the one in the Louvre. They're two good examples. And, you know, he's leaning on his pillow. She has the little vase, the unguentarian. She's pouring something into his hand. In her other hand, she has a pomegranate, which is usually thought of as fertility because of all the seeds inside it. But it's just a beautiful statue. And it, you know, we're going to hear more about how women were treated in ancient Etruria. On this side, on the right-hand side, is the limestone plaque that shows a woman lying on her funeral couch, and people all around her mourning her death. They have, again, this unguentaria. They're carrying something that they are now presenting to her as they're crying over her death. And one of them holds a fan in his hand. It's quite a wonderful piece, and it also is from the Louvre. Well, so some things were meant for the tomb exclusively and could never be used by anybody else. If anybody came and looted the tomb, which they certainly hoped would never have happened, they sealed them. But they are objects like this mirror. This is a bronze mirror that when polished, you would have been able to see your face on it. But it's been ritually killed by putting the holes in it. it would be useful in the next world, but not in this one. And there's a beautiful little funerary vase of a woman that's also from the Louvre. This is from Harvard. On her forehead, it has the word Shuthina, which in Etruscan means for the tomb. So again, never to be used by anyone else. Well, this is the part where they had to restrain me. I tell you, I mean, the Etruscans were just amazing when it came to jewelry making. And you've seen the tiny little grains of gold that they learned how to affix onto the surface. You think, okay, you put the over here and then you heat it again, and that's going to loosen these up. Believe it or not, it was my final paper in an archaeology class as an undergraduate. I wrote about Etruscan granulations, and you know, these earrings, these beautiful earrings that have the granulations in them, are something that you could see at the fine arts museums in the Legion of Honor, usually. And examples like the safety pins, the fibula, over here. In the center, this is from the Field Museum, again, not on view. And so are those earrings with that gorgeous green glass, which was considered a rare commodity. Glass was expensive, also from the Field Museum. But what you see in the middle is an enlargement of what all of these heads are on the necklace. Well, one of the really the largest and also just absolutely beautiful is called a Sphinx fibula, because marching along the bar here, and this is where the pin would be under here, and then you see how it connects where it rolls over there where the bow is. This is all the marching sphinxes, winged sphinxes. This is from the Villa Giulia. Well, this I like to show because, and this is on view in that tomb structure because it's from Praeneste, also from a tomb of an elite. But here, enlarged like this, I mean, it's a small drinking bowl. Enlarged like this, you can see the teeniest little gold balls, so tiny that, yeah, you wonder without a microscope or, you know, something to help you to put these on, they are able to accentuate the designs by putting all of these tiny little balls on it. And this is from the Victoria and Albert Museum, and it was not on view. It was in a safe. Louise and I went to see it. We were able to handle it. That usually doesn't happen. But it's solid gold, and they estimate that it has somewhere around 250,000 grains of gold, the granulation. I'm hoping when they, after the show is over, and it does go to San Antonio after it leaves San Francisco, that they don't have a person, a conservator, counting them to make sure they're all there. It worries me a little. Well, some of the things in the exhibition were only just discovered. And one is this pair of hands. They're made of silver, and the nail polish is gold. It's all gilt. And they're absolutely beautiful things, and they're from a necropolis in Volci, one of the city-states. And this was typical of some of the burials where they had the person carved in wood, but the hands here are silver, and the wood has all decayed because of the damp climate, and so all that's left are these hands. And then this repoussé. This is the kind of fan that you saw on that relief plaque. And it's absolutely gorgeous and amazingly heavy. It's made out of bronze and pushed out from the back to make the repoussé design. Well, now you've heard about Vanth, and this is from the Louvre. And she is holding in her hands this bearded snakes. She's winged. And Lisa was able to show how she helps. She's a guardian figure. She's a purely Etruscan figure, in this case made out of bronze. She's good, she's kind, because she brings you into the next world. Another of the gods that's purely Etruscan is this amazing statue of Usul. He was the sun god, and this is a new work that just came to the Getty Villa not many years ago, and the Getty people, our colleagues from the Getty, were also very generous with their loans, because I know what it means to let this go, because the curator in charge is writing a book about their collection of Etruscan objects, and she's going to be using this as its cover. Because I said, oh, can I use it for my cover? She said, no. But it's the sun god. And you see the rays coming out of his head, the headdress that he's wearing. He has wings that are feathered. His jazz hands are down below. And he is rising from the waters. You see, this is the ocean. And as presumably it's not setting, it looks like he's rising up from the waters on the horizon. And it was used as an applique, presumably as bronze. It was put on a chariot. And one of the things to talk about with the Etruscans is they invented an innovation of theirs is even chariot racing. So this is to make the chariot run faster. Part of one of their legacies to the Romans are the gladiator games. And those grew out of the funeral games that the Etruscans performed. Well, okay, more bronzes and more from the Vatican Museum. And some of you may have seen an exhibition, I think it was 1983-84, one of the shows I worked on, where it had from the various museums at the Vatican, and it included Etruscans from the Vatican Etruscan Museum. And these two objects were in that show. The putti on the left they have a variety of putti, but I said it had to be this one. I love it that he has this medallion. You can see that this is a good luck medallion. It's known as a bulla, and children are wearing it. He has an Etruscan inscription on his shoulder, and the disc contains the Greek god Achelous. And oftentimes you'll say, okay, well, maybe they attributed the same powers and ideas to Greek gods or Roman gods. Not so fast, because they may have adopted the images, but the Etruscans may have had their own ideas. And there we have it. This one took over 2 years to negotiate, and Lisa was very involved in this because it is from Piacenza, and that's where her husband's family is from, if I may say so. And it was that connection that finally made this possible. But it was a very difficult loan for us to have. And the people of Piacenza consider this their iconic work, and they never have lent it since 1877 when it was discovered. Even the director over all of the museums, the national museums in Italy, wanted to use his, he wanted it for his exhibition, and they said no. So he said, "Oh, you can have it, but I can't." But it was a very forward-thinking director and the mayor who realized that it's time it traveled and the world got to know about Piacenza. And so this amazing object that was used for divination, it's a very rare example from the Etruscan world, is in San Francisco for the first time. It doesn't go to San Antonio, unfortunately. And this is the other thing that Lisa was talking about, and it is the Liber Linteus Zagrebiensis. It is the book that is the longest inscription in Etruscan and also the longest textile that exists from the Etruscans. And it is a ritual calendar, which is, I suspect, why the word wine comes up so many times, because wine is part of the ritual. And so on certain days you did sacrifices, other days you did certain prayers, but then wine must have been part of what they did to appease the gods. So as Lisa said, it was found on an Egyptian mummy, a female from the Ptolemaic era. And you can see how it's laid out in the exhibition. Okay, the Etruscans were very fond of Greek pottery, and they collected it. And when you go into a museum and you see a beautiful large vase that is intact, you can be sure it came from an Etruscan tomb, because the others were broken. And here's an example of an Etruscan pot. That is, it was made by a Greek. It was made by somebody whose workshop was in Athens, but he created it for the Etruscan market, which was a very lucrative market. And so you have satyrs and maenads, black figure pottery. It has his name on it, very rare example. His name was Nicosthenes, so it's called a Nicosthenic pot. And it was found in an Etruscan tomb, of course, but it was made in Athens. They followed a lot of the Greek mythology, and some of the Greek pottery makers realized that why have to export things from, well, either the Ionian coast or from Athens, somewhere in Greece? You might as well set up your workshop in the Etruscan region, and this was found in Cairo. And it also is from the Getty Villa. And you'll notice on it, there's the 9-headed Hydra. You remember that story? You cut off one head and two come out from it. So you could never kill it. It just would continue to live. And here you have Heracles, or Hercules, with his club bashing one of these bearded heads. And on the other side, there is his companion with a scythe of some kind to cut off the head. But they figured it out. Under the companion, you can see there is a fire. Because you cut off the head, you cauterize the wound, and two heads can't come from it. So that was done by a fellow that is known as the Eagle Painter. He's a brilliant painter, but he was a Greek. and working for the Etruscan market. The Etruscans themselves created works like this. This one is from the Vatican, and it is a griffin. It's the battle of the Arimasps against the Griffins as they search for and try to gain the gold. The Griffins were guardians of the gold. Very beautiful. Okay, we can just go on now to the banquets. And the upper left is an example of a reclining banqueter from our collection in the museum. He would have been, he was on the rim of a large cauldron at one time, but he's reclining like you've seen all of the others reclining at a banquet. Down below, from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, is a handle. They have two of them, but beautiful bronze work. It just shows you how the Etruscans were masters of bronze smithing, and on both sides you see horses and riders. And we have an incense burner, beautiful incense burner in the center from the Hearst Museum. We were very happy to be able to include that in the collection of this exhibition. And then from the Louvre again, there is this dancer playing like castanets as she's dancing. And that's kind of the spirit of the Etruscans, and we've been using that in some of the advertising, because dance and music and good food, laughter, having a good time, very much the spirit. Well, you've seen this now. It's from the Tomb of the Leopards, and if you've gone to Tarquinia and you've gone into the tomb, you've seen this. But this was also important for us to show with banquets, but very right next to the section on women, because the women were painted a lighter color. You see here she is white, reclining with the man, red. This was a tradition in the ancient Mediterranean world that they were painted different colors. And it shows you how the Etruscan women were more liberated. They were also more literate, because they did find some of these vessels with alphabets on them in female tombs. But this is a wonderful example of the, how the banquet and the wonderful time that they wanted to continue into the next world. But other things having to do with women, we have this beautiful little balsamarium from the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, really very beautiful. And unusual because it's intact, a wooden box. It's just a charming little animal with its head turned backwards, and it opens by swiveling. And it's objects like this that would be placed in these bronze boxes known as kista. And this is from the Morgan Library. It's the only piece of Etruscan art that Mr. J.P. Morgan bought, and he loved it, and we had an opportunity to have an entire afternoon examining all of the figures that are incised on it, and some of them have the names of Greek gods in Etruscan. The handle on the top is an acrobat, and the acrobat is doing a backbend, perfect handle. But the best handle in America is this one, really. And it is sleep and death, carrying off the wounded, the fallen soldier, he's dead, from the fields of Troy during, as if, it's coming right from Homer. It's really beautiful. Mirrors were really important. We have an essay in the catalog about mirrors and mythology, because this is where oftentimes the Etruscans would engrave their images that you can interpret as part of their mythology, their religious beliefs. This one's from Boston, from a woman's tomb. Okay, I don't want to forget that sometimes the images look very idealistic, they're more abstract, but that didn't mean that the Etruscans couldn't do good portraiture. And you have a wonderful example from an island in the middle of Lake Bolsena on the left-hand side, and both of these are superb works of art that are in our last gallery. We had there was a lineup of heads that we could have chosen in terracotta that still had so much color on them. But we chose this one because he looked like Mike Pence. I think I can only say that for the next year or so, and then people will have forgotten who he is anyhow, but he does, doesn't he? Yeah. Yeah. So this is we're entering a room where we're talking about the Etruscans and Rome. Now, one of the new things that has been just uncovered past decade or so is this marvelous example from a site known as San Gimignano, which is right near Volterra. And it looks like Giacometti. And in fact, that's not it's not a bad thing to think about, because Giacometti would go to the Louvre Museum. He was living in Paris, and he was impressed by the Etruscan metalsmithing, and he loved it so much. He actually went to in 1955, they had an exhibition of Etruscan art at the Louvre, and he was really inspired, and he did go to Volterra, and they have this statue, L'Ombra della Sera. And well, we couldn't borrow that, but this one is better in every way, because you can see he's making a libation to the gods. He has a patera in his hand, and so he's worshiping. This is such a beautiful statue, and I'm so happy. And the director of that museum said, well, you can have it only if you pay us enough money that we can make a replica to have it on view. So this is the real one. Well, we have in our last gallery something that it's only been found within the past 2-3 years. It's a site called San Casciano de Bagni, San Casciano of the Baths. And you could think of it as a health spa. You could think of it as the mineral waters that are the curative waters that people go to if they have something wrong with an arm or a leg, they want to be cured. They would make offerings to the gods, and the gods would then cure them. I mean, this is what is hoped for at this point. But at some point, San Casciano was hit by lightning or some such thing, an Etruscan message from the gods, just like they would have a message on the liver. The different parts of the heavens had different domains of the gods. And so lightning was considered a very important thing for the Etruscans. So they sealed over the muddy waters that contained all of these hollow cast bronze objects, like this swaddled baby that's in the exhibition, and this arm and a leg in the exhibition. Notice he's got a bulla around his neck. Either somebody who wanted a baby, or their baby was ill, or maybe it's the opposite, thanking the gods for having delivered a baby to them. This is really important because it shows the quality of the bronze making, even during a period when the Romans were wiping out. They were victorious over a city-state, and one city-state after another, over a couple of centuries, until finally the Etruscans in 89 BC became Roman citizens. Well, here they were worshiping together, and we know that because there are objects that have an inscription in Etruscan and others in Latin. So we know that here was a place where the Etruscans were teaching the Romans something about ritual and praying to the gods, which they continued into the Roman world. So we're thrilled to have anything from this site. They have a big exhibition in Venice right now with some of the others, and I thought, we have to have something, because we have to say finally that it wasn't all warfare between the Romans and the Etruscans. They could worship together at a site like this. So here we have the last gallery, and as I say, this is one where we have our, especially bronzes from this overlapping period of time. And one of our very favorite pieces is this one, and his name, he's a god, his name is Veovis, which is Etruscan for Jupiter. He isn't like Zeus, who's an older man, you see him bearded. This is a young man. He's a different kind of Zeus. He has different ideas. He has different powers. He holds a lightning bolt in his right hand, but unlike the Greeks, where it's only Zeus who can hurl the lightning bolt, there were many Etruscan gods who could do that, and it would depend which part of the heavens the bolt came from, that they could decide which god was speaking to them. So it's a gorgeous statue, and when Louise and I went to Viterbo, which is where this is in its museum, we had to run from the car we were in to the train station. It was pouring. We were absolutely drenched. We only had to go maybe 4 feet, and we were totally soaking wet. We ran upstairs. The station master was holding the train for us, and then all of a sudden, the station was hit by lightning. And I said to Louise, it's going to be a good show. So we have this exhibition, and finally we do have the Etruscans taking center stage, and we have them. We now know viticulture, we know architecture. The arch came from the Etruscans. They were the ones who taught the Romans how to drain the swamps that became the Forum. They were the people who taught them. We call them the Roman numerals. No, you go to the museum and you look at one of the cinerary urns and you'll see it was the Etruscan numbering system. They taught them how to deal with the sewage, the Cloaca Maxima, that also was Etruscan. So I know Lisa feels the same way that I do. We've wanted to do this show for so many years, to be able to tell everyone this missing link that was the Etruscans, that taught the Romans so much, and then, of course, influenced our Western civilization. And so it's all come down to us. Now you have the missing link. So thank you so much.
We're going to start with the question asked not only by a couple of people here, but someone online at the same time, which is, when was the Etruscan language first translated and first deciphered? And has it been done yet, basically? It has, how much progress has been made and that kind of thing? How recent is that?
Well, I think it's been a long process, I'll say that. I don't know if there's an actual year that we could all agree on when they started to decipher Etruscan language, but I would say certainly in the 20th century, scholars could understand certain words, and a lot of linguistic work was done in the 20th century on the Etruscan language. And we know more now than ever before because there have been more comprehensive studies and a vocabulary has been built up. It's very difficult to reconstruct a language when you are primarily looking at funerary inscriptions. There's about 13,000 or so funerary inscriptions that have survived. But if you went to a cemetery at like Colma and tried to reconstruct English from looking at graves and inscriptions, it'd be really difficult because where would be your Fitzgerald or your Maya Angelou or your,
you might
Mark Twain or,
you might get the idea they're obsessed with death.
James Baldwin. Yeah, I mean, where would all of those works of literature be, right? So
Yeah.
we know Etruscans wrote history and poetry and prose. It's just that their language hasn't survived.
Yeah. Right?
Yeah, I was going to say that when I showed the length, the longest Etruscan inscription, and I said it was a book, and you're looking at strips, but the books were made, the sheet of linen would be folded over and under and over and under, so it's not cut, so you open it up, and that's where you're able to have it. There's no real Rosetta Stone. There are only, from Pyrgi, the gold tablets that are in Etruscan and Phoenician and what else?
Etruscan and Phoenician,
Yes,
yeah.
it's so that, there are some words that you can see. And there is, in Cortona, a bronze plaque. But other than that, because the reason why what we have on view in the museum is still there is because it was found in Egypt. All of the books that must have been, and they certainly were known for the number of books that they wrote and their intelligence, either were destroyed by the elements or on purpose, maybe by the Romans.
Mm-hmm.
So a desert civilization is a good place to have your so Las Vegas is going to be representative of America in the future. Is that your point?
Probably.
All right. Apparently we have one of the primary candidates for insurance commissioner for California in the audience, because he asked the question, what is the cost of insurance for this exhibit? And was it difficult to get? And which of the companies gave it to you so that we can make them lose their license? No.
You could thank them. This is something that is determined by the lender. Every time either my museum or any museum is asked for something for an exhibition, and things do travel, quid pro quo, you lend me this, I'll borrow that. It's the museum itself that we're borrowing from that sets the insurance value. And we have an international insurer, and we have an entire department, registration department, that deals with packing, shipping, insurance, couriers. I mean, you want to talk about how much money you spend bringing things. We always have to have couriers with all of the objects so that things are properly treated. The Amount of money, I have no idea. I never asked. But, sometimes if you know in advance that objects are coming and you know how much money they are insured for, the federal government has a program that will cover. That's how we get the Tut treasures, by federal government covering the insurance.
In all these years of doing these exhibits, has anyone at any of these museums ever said, we will lend this to you, but we need to send one of our people and they're going to sit in the room with it for the entire exhibit? Oh, really?
Almost.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had the Book of Kells.
Oh, yeah.
And the early Irish Treasures exhibition actually had the Book of Kells. And it was in a temperature humidity controlled, but there was the same person who was there, and once a week he turned the page.
A specialist.
Yeah, he was. He was the librarian.
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of questions about the influences on Etruscan culture from before. And one of the questions, so we'll go through a few of those. One of the questions is, did Etruscans have any art that we know about before there was any influence from Greek art?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you need to remove that sort of mindset.
Yeah.
I think that they didn't know how to do anything. There was years and centuries of Etruscan artwork before they came into contact with Greeks.
So that would mean that the next question, are there any influences from Minoan art?
That's a good question. I think people are probably thinking of wall painting when they think about Minoan art and thinking how similar it is. I think the techniques are similar, but they're at different time periods, completely different time periods and separated by centuries. And also, geographically very separated. So I would have to say no to that. Yeah.
And so here's one says, the profiles of Etruscans seem unique to me, something between Egyptian and Roman features with gleaming eyes and bemused smiles. Is that their look? Is that where the Etruscan smile idea comes from?
The Etruscan smile is something that appeals to everyone. I think when people walk into the exhibition at the Legion of Honor now and they see that smile, that's what's making the art so accessible. They feel comfortable. They feel like they could talk to that person, right? Yeah. But if we could say, if we can refer to the Greek world again, and if we could use a term that's used for the Greek world, there is that archaic smile that you do see on related objects throughout the Mediterranean. But the Etruscans never lost it.
No, and I think, Renee showed a canopic urn, but if you look at some of those early proto-portraits of those urns from Chiusi, where they have the human faces, which are probably an attempt at showing an actual Etruscan, and you walk outside of some of these local museums in the heartland of Tuscany, you will see distant relatives that look very similar to some of these faces on these urns, or at least people say this to me, and I don't think there's a major distinction in many ways.
So, one of the conclusions from that is that the PhD thesis that claimed that irony was a creation of the medieval times was probably not accurate. People were already laughing. Another one of the influences that really goes far abroad, one of the objects you showed fascinated me because it was the bronze bowl with the lion decoration. It reminded me of several bronze objects I saw in the National Museum in Beijing. Did the Etruscans engage in trade with China during the 7th century BC? And if so, to what extent was there any cross-cultural influences?
We have no evidence of that
No.
whatsoever.
But sometimes it's the material itself that defines how the forms are made. And I did mention that was similar to what you found from Urartu, another culture that used large cauldrons and had these animal protomes, they're called, looking out from them. And that is today's Armenia. So it doesn't mean the Etruscans went that far, because then they influenced the Syrians. So, I mean, you have cross-cultural things going on without ever having to reach all the way to where their homeland was.
Right. Was there any secret to their vibrant colors in their art, and you know, I mean, the actual creation of the color that went into the art, because it hasn't faded as much as other art from that time?
I don't know. I don't think there was technically any secret. I think that if I would like you to remember something about the Etruscans, it's their love of color. I mean, I showed you those terracotta heads. They were painted vibrantly. It's just the color hasn't survived. And they were not chromophobic, as I also said. So their temples were painted, their homes were painted, their tombs are painted. So they had this, they used color in ways that I think make them very distinct. And they sort of exude that colorful vibrancy, you know, in the artworks that have survived.
All right. This is a political question. The Etruscans had city-states. Was there any sort of organization to keep them united, other than, you mentioned language, religion, that kind of thing? Did they have, I mean, because like the Greeks had city-states, and they sometimes got together and had leagues and then didn't, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, who wants to go first?
Okay, I'll just say, yes, they did have leagues. They talk about leagues of 12 city-states. Sometimes they were different city-states. But what made it possible for the Romans to pick them off city-state by city-state is that they did not combine that
Forces.
way, yeah, so, or a militia or whatever, so that they could fight off any invading people, and it wasn't just the Romans who were invading. So I think that was part of the downfall.
They did not have a unified military. So independent city-states protected independent city-states, each individual city-state, which, as Renee just said, made it very easy for the Romans to sort of pick off one by one as they made their way up north.
If anyone's here from the European Union and just heard that, it might be very useful right now. I'm not trying to predict the next 20 years, but okay. How did the Hearst family obtain so many precious Etruscan artifacts, and how do the Italians feel about this?
That's a good question. That's a fair question. So Phoebe Hearst became sort of a fairy godmother of UC Berkeley at the turn of the 20th century, and found herself to be the wealthiest woman in America, literally at the turn of the 20th century, and remarkably dedicated her finances to education, not just the University of California, Berkeley, but the kindergarten program that swept across the United States was kickstarted by Phoebe Apperson Hearst. I don't know if any of you know that. So she was passionate about education, and her idea was to build up a teaching collection of artifacts from all over the world, and provide that to UC Berkeley. I don't know if you all know this, but there's about 3 million artifacts in the Hearst collection at UC Berkeley. And as Renee mentioned, their museum space is very small. 4,000 of those artifacts are Etruscan. And she acquired these artifacts because she had art advisors who aided her and traveled abroad and acquired these collections that then came directly to the University of California, Berkeley for students, for student use and for student study. And you asked, how does Italy feel about this? They were all required, I'm speaking of the Etruscan collection, acquired legally. Acquired legally.
That's pretty good for that period of time. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, I mentioned also their Egyptian collection. It has a world-class collection of pre-dynastic, really early material. Also, an expert was helping her with the Egyptian materials. So, I mean, that museum has such great treasures.
And that comes to the next question, because it's somebody who's very practical about going to visit museums. Since so many pieces from UC are currently at the Legion of Honor, should I wait to go to Doe until after the exhibit closes at the Legion and they go back? I'm sure the answer is no.
I would go to the Doe Library this summer because that closes before the Legion of Honor. It closes at the end of August. The Legion of Honor is open until September 20th.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very good answer. So, what do we know about the Katabos game? Katabos.
Katabos.
Katabos, yeah.
Oh, there's a little player in the exhibition made out of bronze, and it's in the banquet section. They had this game. It was a silly game. I mean, you twirl your drinking cup around, and then there's a target, and you see the dregs to see if you can't get the dregs close to
From your wine.
have the wine.
Yeah, it's a drinking game.
It's a drinking game.
You would take your drinking cup, let's say it's a Kylex, and you would flick the residue inside the drinking cup after you drank your wine. You would flick it at a target. And
Whoever
that
got
sounds strange
closest.
to you. Just think about college drinking games today.
Yeah.
You know.
The Russian cavalry throwing all their glasses into the fireplace. So there's several questions on the women, gender equality in the upper classes, and the affection between the spouses. That's another PhD thesis that got overturned by that. There was one that said that the Roland, the stories about Roland and so on, were the start of all romance. Before that, it was all business. I don't know why you guys pass these PhD theses along. But in any case, so this is a very clear, I mean, there are some ancient Egyptian things that show affection between people, and
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But it's still relatively rare. And so is there a reason why the Etruscans did better at this? And maybe that's why they were smiling.
Yeah, I think.
I find that one of the most fascinating aspects of Etruscan culture, to be fair, is the sort of intimacy that we see between couples, between husbands and wives, given that Etruscan women had very high status and a lot of freedoms and exercised certain sort of activities that were not common in Greece and Rome. And Etruscan women could be present at banquets, they could toast to whomever they wanted to, they could learn to be priestesses. There were lots of different roles in Etruscan society that showcase the important role of women. And within that, we see the couple celebrated. And I think it speaks to a really, key feature of Etruscan life and Etruscan culture, which I find really interesting.
Yeah.
All right, there's one tiny, detailed question, not tiny. What are the orals out of elements at the top of the wall in the tomb you showed? There's a sort of like circular elements, I think maybe. Oval, that's why it wasn't oral.
The
What are the
leopards,
oval
the
elements
Tomb of the
that-
leopards?
Which tomb was
You
it?
mean that, or the
I think it was
hunting
the
and
Tomb of the
fishing?
Leopard. Tomb of the Leopards, was it?
Is the person who asked the question here?
Was it the Tomb of the Leopards that it was in?
Yes.
Yeah, in the Tomb of the Leopards, the oval elements.
Well, probably just decorative motif.
Yeah.
Was it this tomb? Or was it
The one with the,
Hunting and fishing, or this one?
maybe the
One
hunting
with the
and
leopards.
fishing? Yeah.
yeah.
Hunting and
Oh,
fishing.
yeah, decorative motifs.
I hate to end with the final thing because they're all about grave robbing.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
George.
What happened to the bodies? You know, what
Oh, no.
when the bodies of the women in the tombs, what happened to them? And did the women's bodies get stolen before the husband's ashes? I'm not sure.
Well,
why.
that's impossible to answer.
Yeah,
I know
yeah.
what they...
I think
I always end with those kind of questions.
morbid questions. I think you have to realize that, okay, is the person asking when tomb robbers went into tombs,
Yeah.
what happened to the bones or the skeletons?
Yeah.
I mean, they were oftentimes just ignored or stomped over or just thrown off to the side in some way because they're looking for precious items.
Rings taken off
And
the
they're
fingers.
they're
all
not
that.
interested in preservation of the skeletal remains at all.
And this is the ancient version of it. When the family opened a tomb for the next person that needed to be put in there, did they notice body and objects still there? Did they change ideas about the afterlife as a result of what happened? I mean, is there any record of
Well, we have no
this
record
bad
of this.
reaction to?
Yeah.
But we have no record of this. But since couples would be buried in the same tomb, you can imagine that you would be looking at a decomposing body. Let's say your husband died 2 years ago. Now you've passed, and your family's burying you. They would have been used to seeing,
Yeah.
a decomposed body, and they would have brought in incense and burned things inside the tomb and made it profumatic, and that was part of the funerary ritual. So seeing that sort of decayed corpse probably wasn't as strange as it may appear to us today. What would you add to that, Renee?
Yeah, I was again thinking of the Egyptian world, and in each case with the Egyptian world, it isn't the body is the important element. And one would think that, I mean, I'm reading into the Etruscan because there's nothing written that tells us this, that the loss of the body does not mean the person no longer exists.
Yeah. All right, well, we got 2 more questions now from YouTube, from the people who've been watching live stream. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll finish up with those. So one is real specific. Is there anything in the exhibit from the Etruscan Museum in Volterra?
Yes. Actually, we borrowed a skiphos from Volterra, and it will be on view. That's a good question. It will be. We had asked for the cinerary urn where the person has the liver in his hand. Unfortunately, it was promised to another museum, so we couldn't get that. But there's a skiphos, and a beautiful example of Bouguereau, which will be on view. Not on view yet. It needed conservation.
And now, one of the cleverest observers this question has found a hole in the system here. The question is, where did the Etruscan language come from? Since it's not Indo-European, but you said that the Etruscans were native. They didn't come from anywhere, that they're native Italic people. So you've got the native Italic people. So it's not like a group came in and then, like the Hungarians and the Finns, that everyone kind of has an idea about. But so it's an unusual, a native group with an unusual language that doesn't have any relation to the things around them. That's a good question.
You got to get the catalog.
I get the catalog. I mean, I would answer that by saying, the Etruscans didn't have a problem with their language, right? It made perfect sense to them.
Yeah.
And the fact that it baffles us, maybe it forces us to think about languages in a different way,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. That's a perfect answer.
That's perfect.
Very good
answer.
question, though. Very, very observant
Yeah.
question.
There are 2 related languages, not the same language, but related. One comes from the Italian Alps, and the other one from the island of Lesbos. And that's all that the specialists, the scholars will say, is that they are related.
And those are inscriptions, too.
And they're again short inscriptions, so one doesn't really know. But that's the closest they can come to languages that have similar semantic examples.
All right, so ends another event at the Commonwealth Club and for Humanities West.
That was good.
And we'll see you on July 1st.